chat. Welcome to a new episode of System Update. Speaking of war propaganda, there were two major journalistic events this week in the United States designed to fortify a narrative that we've been covering from the start. Namely, that American Jews, once safe in the United States, are now a uniquely endangered and vulnerable victim group. Time magazine, that is now owned by a fanatical supporter of Israel who is a billionaire, published an article by Harvard Law professor and longtime Israel supporter Noah Feldman, arguing that the United States is now subsumed in what it calls, quote, the new anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, another fanatical and very prominent and wealthy and influential Israel supporter, Bari Weiss, was invited to give a speech on the, quote, state of world Jewry at the 92nd Street Y in Manhattan, just weeks after they canceled another scheduled speech by the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Viet Thanh Nguyen due to his criticism of Israel. And in that speech, Weiss also announced a new victimhood narrative for American Jews, while also advocating the classic neocon worldview that demands that the United States either fight or finance multiple foreign wars, knowing that that is a mentality which, of course, will lead to and justify having the U.S. continue to finance and arm Israel's military and all of its wars. This mentality has become more dominant than ever, despite its self-victimizing claims that those who believe this are relegated to the dangerous fringes of society and are somehow silenced, yet we hear from them continuously in all of the most influential venues. And because of how dominant this worldview has become, we think it is highly worth considering. Now, we know this topic is polarizing and divisive to a lot of people, but there's just no question that the war in Gaza has become something unlike we really have seen, certainly in the 21st century. And it's just not something that can be avoided because some people prefer that we do, or some people disagree with us on our perspective. We do our best to show you the truth, our sources for them, the documentation for it, in the hopes that you will evaluate it objectively, regardless of your view, and then decide for yourself. That ultimately is our job, not to tell you what you want to hear or to flatter all your views, but to cover the things that we think most need coverage. When I first started writing about politics in 2005 in order to focus on the war on terror, the word neocon was very much in vogue. People used it all the time. People understood what it meant. It generally referred to a group of people who previously had been part of the Democratic Party, who decided to migrate to the Republican Party because they perceived that their agenda, that typically was focused on wars all over the world, a posture of endless war, convincing people that the United States would benefit by involving itself in all sorts of foreign wars, culminating in steadfast U.S. support for Israel. They decided that in the era of the war on terror, that they would benefit a lot more from joining the Republican Party, and they turned out to be right about that. And these are people like Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith and ultimately Dick Cheney. So it kind of spread to the people who became their allies and advocates, who weren't originally liberals, but who nonetheless took on this worldview that the United States needs to crusade in the world through its military to spread democracy. It's what led to the invasion of Iraq. They wanted to do regime change in Iran. They wanted to bomb Libya and remove Gaddafi. They wanted to do the same in Syria with Assad. It became an ideology, and it was a very recognizable one because it was against the strain of Republican politics that was humble about or skeptical towards intervention. It wanted a very, quote, robust foreign policy, meaning involving Americans in all kinds of wars all over the world, knowing that this kind of active mentality of militarism would also justify and explain to Americans why they should support Israel in all of its wars as well. That Israel's wars are our enemies are our enemies, and that became the predominant mentality. Notably, neocons started remigrating back to the Democratic Party, where most of them now are, primarily in the wake of Trump. Although even before Trump, with Ron Paul's success, they started realizing that the Republican Party and the American right was becoming inhospitable to that worldview. And as a result, ever since they've migrated back to the Democratic Party, people like Bill Kristol and David Frum and the like, that word neocon is rarely used anymore. But I think it's still a very valuable word because it absolutely does reflect a certain kind of mentality about the U.S. role in the world, about militarism, about our policy toward war generally, and specifically toward Israel. And one of the things that has been done since October 7th in order to rejuvenate this idea among Americans that they need to be fighting wars all over the country, including wars that aren't ours, that aren't against enemies attacking the United States, is to use October 7th to say that there is a new bigotry consuming the United States. There is a new special victim group that once again has become the vulnerable group of race, vulnerable to racism and the like, and that is American Jews. And then combined with that is an argument that we need to be supporting Israel, and that anyone who questions that or anyone who opposes what Israel is doing is probably guilty of this new anti-Semitism. And you can tell there's a lot of power behind this mentality, even though they're trying to claim that they're a marginalized group, that they're in danger in the United States. They appear in every one of the most influential and powerful platforms to make this case. And just this week, there is a cover story in Time magazine, which obviously is not the same Time magazine as it once was. It was probably the most influential media outlet during the Cold War, even into the 80s and 90s. But it still packs a lot of punch. It still carries a heavy brand name for a lot of people. And particularly the Time cover is something that a lot of people see. Time magazine is now owned by a pro-Israel billionaire. It is, the editor-in-chief is also a fanatical pro-Israel longtime journalist who I think you can safely describe as a neocon. And then this week they released this new cover story that is attracting a lot of attention. And it's written by Noah Feldman, who was kind of a classic neocon during the Bush-Cheney years. He was actually part of what was called the Provisional Government in Iraq, the one that the Bush and Cheney put into Iraq during the invasion to try and control what that government would be, which was ultimately the purpose of the invasion of Iraq. Noah Feldman was actually part of that. He's not a very obvious figure to be a representative of a marginalized and oppressed group, because he has basically had the most elite life possible. He went to Harvard and Yale Law School. He went to Oxford. He's taught on the Harvard Law School faculty forever. He's been a celebrated intellectual. He was part of the Bush-Cheney government. He became one of the leading witnesses in support of the first Trump impeachment. And he has access to the cover story of Time magazine to write an article saying that his own group, American Jews, are a uniquely victimized group, and essentially that they are victimized by a new kind of anti-Semitism that basically includes anyone questioning U.S. support for the war in Israel or questioning the Israeli government in any sort of a harsh way. And this is now a celebrated Time cover. There you see Nie wieder ist jetzt, which is German for, I believe, never again is now, right? Never again is now. And you see the Star of David there, and then the headline is the new anti-Semitism. So obviously using German, it's intended to evoke this kind of very alarming iconography. And it's essentially arguing that there's a new radical anti-Semitism in the United States that is rendering American Jews, despite all their apparent power, the fact that they have been extremely safe in the United States and continue to be, in my view, for reasons we've gone over many times. But this is an attempt to say the new anti-Semitism has arisen since October 7th and is based in opposition to Israel, which means if you're a critic of Israel, you're likely guilty of this new anti-Semitism. Here's some of the article. Quote, in the months following Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7, 2023, anti-Semitic incidents increased substantially. The Anti-Defamation League, which I guess a lot of people trust now, didn't trust at all until October 7th, but now do, which keeps track, said they tripled in the U.S. over the previous year, although its criteria also changed to include anti-Zionism. In other words, there's an expanded definition of anti-Semitism by the ADL that if you say something that the ADL interprets as anti-Zionist, they will count that as an anti-Semitic act. The core of this new anti-Zionism lies in the idea that Jews are not a historically oppressed people seeking self-preservation, but are instead oppressors, imperialists, colonialists, and even white supremacists. Now, Noah Feldman was part of the Iraq War. He was part of the attempt to impose on Iraq a government by the United States. He is a vehement supporter of the war in Gaza. He is a vehement supporter of Israel. If you call him an imperialist or an oppressor, or you look at his lineage and his very privileged life and deny that he's a victim, then according to him, you are guilty of this new anti-Semitism. Quote, this view preserves vestiges of the trope that Jews exercise vast power. It creatively updates the narrative to contemporary circumstances and current cultural preoccupations with the nature of power and injustice. Israel, the first Jewish state to exist in 2 millennia, plays a central role in the narrative of the new anti-Semitism. While a well-meaning person free of anti-Semitism could describe Israel as colonialist, the narrative of Israel as a settler colonial oppressor on par with or worse than the US, Canada, and Australia is fundamentally misleading. Those who advance it run the risk of perpetuating anti-Semitism by condemning the Jewish state despite its basic differences from those other global examples. Most importantly, Israel's status as the only homeland for historically oppressed people who have nowhere else to call their own. To emphasize the narrative of Jews as oppressors, the new anti-Semitism must also somehow sidestep not only 2 millennia of Jewish oppression, but also the Holocaust, the largest organized institutionalized murder of any ethnic group in human history. On the right, anti-Semites either deny the Holocaust ever happened or claim its scope has been overstated. How big of a group is that of people on the right who deny the Holocaust or revise the Holocaust? On the left, he says, one line is that Jews are weaponizing the Holocaust to legitimize the oppression of Palestinians. All right, let me just say, that's something I believe. I believe that the ADL and a lot of pro-Israel organizations weaponize the Holocaust to shield Israel from valid critiques. The idea that that makes you an anti-Semite, to believe that, or to criticize Israel, to question Israel, or to question whether Jews are a unique victim group in the United States, the idea that any of that is anti-Semitic is obviously unbelievably manipulative. Probably the biggest grievance of people on the American right, of conservatives in the United States, about the left, has been that the left uses identity politics, they weaponize racism accusations in order to stifle debate, to destroy the reputations of anybody who agrees with them. What is this, if not that? Accusing everybody who disagrees with Noah Feldman on Israel of being part of the new anti-Semitism, of saying that anybody who rejects the idea that American Jews require special privileges in the United States is guilty of the new anti-Semitism. This is exactly everything the American right has claimed that they hate. Accusing people who disagree with you of being racist, weaponizing bigotry accusations to stifle debate. This is all this is in its most blatant form. Quote, during the Gaza war, some have argued that Israel, having suffered the trauma of the Holocaust, is now itself perpetuating a genocide against the Palestinian people. Accusing Israel of genocide can function, intentionally or otherwise, as a way of erasing the memory of the Holocaust and transforming Jews from victims into oppressors. If that's not an argument to demonize everybody who questions Israel as an anti-Semite, and then I've never seen that before. It is that flagrantly, explicitly. And as for the question of whether American Jews are victims, and whether you can question whether they are, let's look at who Noah Feldman is. Here is his official biography from Harvard Law School, where he teaches. Noah Feldman is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law. Felix Frankfurter, by the way, is one of the most influential Supreme Court justices of the 20th century. He was Jewish, like many American Supreme Court justices throughout the 20th century. And Noah Feldman is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law, the chairman of the Society of Fellows, and the founding director of the Julius Rabbanowitz Program on Jewish and Israeli Law, all at Harvard University. Usually programs like the Julius Rabbanowitz Program are named after very large donors to the institution. In 2003, Noah Feldman served as senior constitutional advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, and subsequently advised members of the Iraqi Governing Council on the drafting of Iraq's interim constitution. Feldman received his GAD from Yale Law School, where he served as a book review editor of the Yale Law Journal. He clerked for Justice David Souter of the U.S. Supreme Court and Chief Judge Harry T. Edwards of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. If you don't regard Noah Feldman and people like him as a victim, but rather as somebody of great influence and power, then according to his cover story in Time magazine, published in a magazine owned by an Israel supporter, run by an editor who's a fanatical Israel supporter, written by Noah Feldman, a fanatical Israel supporter, that if you don't see him and people like him as victims in the United States requiring special privileges, you are guilty of the new anti-Semitism. Another person who is here to argue this is Bari Weiss, who used to work at the Wall Street Journal. Then she quit the New York Times in protest of a lot of critique she had of that paper that I shared. She then created her own media outlet at Substack, where it's producing many millions of dollars to great financial success. It's a huge, hugely supported website. She's become extremely prominent as a spokesperson against anti-Semitism and on behalf of Israel. She has access to every major platform. She spoke this week at the 92nd Street Y, and luminaries like Jerry Seinfeld and other extremely wealthy supporters of Israel attended. Very hard to depict Bari Weiss as well, a graduate of Columbia, as some sort of a marginalized victim in the United States. And yet, she too was here to argue, not for the first time, that American Jews are uniquely vulnerable in the United States, that American Jews are endangered, actually, and that one of the manifestations of this anti-Semitism that American Jews are endangered by is the criticism of Israel, the questioning of whether or not the United States should fight, not only in Israel, but also for Ukraine, and in general, just the neocon worldview that the United States should be involved in multiple wars around the world. The irony of her speech is that the 92nd Street Y had invited the Pulitzer Prize-winning author who was critical of Israel and yet canceled his speech because he was a critic of Israel, and instead invited Bari Weiss to come and speak instead, just to give you kind of a sense for who victims are, who is repressed in the United States and who isn't. And here's part of what Bari Weiss said in outlining her foreign policy, what this new anti-Semitism is, and what all of our obligations are when it comes to Israel.
The world is changing. The world that so many of us were born into. The world that we thought we were going to get our lives inside. That world is done. There's no going back to it. And the things that we took for granted, that America would always remain exceptional, not just for us, but for the world, and that Americans themselves would understand this as a place and as an idea worth fighting for, those are no longer certainties. Nor is the certainty of the free world itself, which is burning right now at its outer edges. All of it, the ideals and the architecture that have made the past 75 years of Jewish life the greatest in the history of the world, it's up for grabs. Ask the people of southern Israel, who saw on the morning of October 7th how brittle is the fence that separates civilization from barbarism.
So there you see that framework. Israel is the civilized part of the world. The Palestinians are are barbaric, the savages, the subhumans. And the fact that Israel, which occupies lands that belonged to it only since 1948, displaced a lot of Arabs from that land, that chooses to occupy the West Bank illegally in the eyes of the world, that blockades Gaza in all the ways that we've described and now is bombing Gaza, the fact that Israel can be attacked by a much weaker group of people that they're now obliterating, somehow is supposed to mean that American Jews in the United States are also endangered. And that if you question this war in any way, you are part of the opposition to the defense of the free world. If you question the war in Ukraine, you're part of this movement that is undermining the defense of the free world. The only way you can be part of the defense of the free world, according to Bari Weiss, and the only way you can be relieved of the accusation of anti-Semitism is if you cheer for American wars, all the ones that she supports, including in Ukraine, but also, most importantly, supporting the war in Israel.
Ask the people of Taiwan, who hear Beijing's threats and wonder how soon the dark shadow that has fallen over Hong Kong might consume them too. Ask the people of Ukraine. Ask the Navalny family. In one of the beautiful and haunting letters that Alexei Navalny sent from a prison cell in the Arctic Circle to Natan Sharansky in Jerusalem, he wrote about how strange it was to be reading Sharansky's memoir, Fear No Evil, about his time in the Soviet Gulag 40 years before. I was amused by the fact, he writes, that neither the essence of the system nor the pattern of its acts has changed. He continued, in the current situation, it is not them who are to blame. He says amazingly of the KGB. And this is the crucial part. It is not them who are to blame, but us, who naively thought that there was no going back to the old ways.
So that is the neocon worldview stated perfectly. Bari Weiss absolutely has a way with words. When she was hired by the New York Times, it was exactly at the same time that the New York Times had hired Bret Stephens, and liberals were indignant about the hiring of Bret Stephens. He was a climate denier and all these other bad things. And I wrote an article saying, actually, Bari Weiss is the much more consequential hire. I knew that she was a very shrewd and savvy media operator. And I knew she was going to have this kind of an influence. And what she's saying is a very pernicious but effective message, which is, if you want to be on the side of good, and you want to avoid being someone who's a threat to American Jews, you need to step up and cheer for American wars in all these places. You need to fight China. You need to fight Russia. You need to fight Israel's enemies, Iran. This is what neocons do. This is the way that they get Americans to constantly pay for and cheer for wars that are not in their interest, that have nothing to do with the way of life in the United States, by constantly linking all of Israel's enemies to part of this greater battle that we are all facing between the civilized people, the Americans, Europe, Israel, and all of Israel's enemies, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, Russia, so that we continue to view Israel as our great ally whose military we should pay for, whose wars we should finance, because it's part of our duty to be part of this bigger vision to defend freedom. And if you don't think that, if you question whether or not Israel belongs there in that group, if you think that it's not actually in our interest to pay for Israel's wars and to tie ourselves at the hip to Israel and to fight for the war in Ukraine, then you're probably someone who's a coward, unlike Alexei Navalny, the former neo-Nazi that Bari Weiss loves, and the Azov battalion in Ukraine, the current neo-Nazi battalion that Bari Weiss loves, and obviously the people in Israel currently starving the population of Gaza to death. These are all your duties as a good human being, to have America arm and fund all these wars. That is the neocon tactic, and it has been for decades. They don't want to just say you're duty bound to finance and stand by Israel. That would be too obvious. They want to make it part of this broader vision where Israel is part of the civilized, superior peoples, and Israel's enemies are savages, and so are anyone who defies the United States. And that's how we get endless war. That is the neocon mentality, and it is more dominant than ever because it is attached now to the Democratic Party at least as much as the Republican Party. They view Donald Trump as a threat to that vision, but they also view this kind of Ron Paul anti-interventionism as a threat as well, which is why they began migrating back to the Democratic Party before Donald Trump appeared. Now, one of the things that I really appreciate is that there are some strong Israel supporters, some vehement Israel supporters who are contemptuous of this attempt to turn American Jews into some new victim group. One of them is Batya Junger-Sargon, who was on my show in November, where she and I debated her support for the war in Israel. And she was one of the first guests we had on who supported the war in Israel. She's a vehement supporter of Israel. And at the time, I asked her about this newfound attempt to try and turn Jewish students at Harvard and Yale and Penn into victims who were endangered. And she heaped scorn on that attempt on my show. This is what she said.
There's never been a country as good to the Jews as the United States is. I think most Jews should feel, if they don't, incredibly grateful to be American. The First Amendment is an inextricable part of what makes this country. And
this is at the time, by the way, when there was a very aggressive movement to impose censorship on American college campuses on the grounds that anti-Semitism was this wild bigotry that needed to be controlled through silencing and censoring of Israel critics. And it was a right-wing view that mimicked perfectly the left-wing view for censorship on college campuses, that criticism of Israel was hate speech, it was threatening to a marginalized group, American Jews, and that American Jews could only be protected through censorship, exactly what the left-wing censorship case is. And Batya was one of the few people willing to oppose it on principle equally, and that's what she was saying.
To me, the idea of endorsing a ban on BDS is just so anti-Jewish. And I, obviously I'm offended by the idea of like boycotting Jews. I don't like that. But what I like even less is the idea of exercising state power against an individual citizen or business's right or what have you, to express their political views. I hate all of that. Please walk down the street in my neighborhood and chant, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. That is your I don't want to say God-given, but that is your right as an American. And that is why I am an American and why I love this country and think this is the best country on earth. So from the point of view, first of all, of just like state censorship, absolutely unacceptable and just so totally inappropriate. The second level of things we're seeing is students facing what they're seeing as harassment on college campuses. Now, is harassment happening? There's a lot of this chanting. There's a lot of protests. There have been 3 instances by my count of actual physical violence, or
which of course is a
acts.
crime. Those are crimes. Those are actual crimes.
Which of course is a crime, and we have actual laws on the books to protect people from them. I don't believe in hate crimes because I think for something to get from a crime to a hate crime means you're policing somebody's thoughts. I don't believe in that. So I don't even think that there should be such a thing as a hate crime. But those 3 events are crimes, will be prosecuted as such. 3 events, you've had thousands of people protesting. I mean, obviously we've not met the bar of incitement to violence, right? This is not mass violence. And so to me, the messaging to college students that they should see themselves as unsafe, I hate it. I hate to see it. I hate to see Jewish students cowering. That is the wrong message for this moment. Stand up straight, stand up tall, be proud in who you are, put on tefillin. If you allow me to say that here, but embrace your heritage. Stop embracing the safetyism. Is there a double standard for Jewish students and for other minority students? There is. You know what? The university system is hopelessly flawed. It's deeply woke. I'm sure, Glenn, you and I would have very similar critiques of the safetyism. The way out of that is not to embrace the safetyism.
So, when I was talking today about this Time magazine article and then Bari Weiss's speech, which are part of the same effort to convert American Jews into a unique victim group, I noted this video that Batya had when she appeared on our show where she was expressing her contempt for this narrative. And I said, look, I don't know. I haven't spoken to Batya in a while. I don't know. I don't want to imply that she still thinks this way, but this is what she was saying back in November. And in response, she replied and pointed to this video, this interview that she gave just this week, yesterday in fact, about this kind of Time magazine, Bari Weiss narrative that American Jews are in danger, that they're one of the unique victim groups, that they need all kinds of special protections and privileges, and particularly people who criticize Israel need to be accused of anti-Semitism and the worst bigotry. And here's the scorn she heaped on that this week, again, in a very convincing way.
Fighting anti-Semitism starts with accurately assessing it. For Jewish students at the most elite universities on the planet, young people with more privilege than 99% of Americans could ever dream of, to be encouraged to see themselves as the victims of a bunch of chanting nincompoops is truly a betrayal, not just of America, but of what it means to be a Jew. We are descended from the Maccabees, for God's sake. Quaking in the face of some chanting leftists is totally beneath us, as is begging them to recognize us or accept our ideology. I understand that it is uncomfortable, especially when you're 18 or 20, to know that your peers look down on you. But that discomfort is your moral compass letting you know that it still works.
So obviously she and I have totally different views on Israel and the war in Gaza. We explored that on the show. But the idea that Jewish students at Harvard and Yale and Penn, let alone the highest elites that American culture has to create, like Noah Feldman, and his editor-in-chief at Time and the owner of Time magazine, have the right to be looked at as special victims because they're a part of a minority group that exercises enormous power in every major sector of American life, from government to media to Wall Street to Silicon Valley to Hollywood, is a disgrace. It is exactly the kind of self-victimizing that is subject to the most intense mockery and scorn when it comes from the left. And yet now, in the name of Israel and protecting Israel and demeaning its critics, we're all supposed to suddenly embrace this same victimhood narrative of identity politics and vulnerability and prejudice and bigotry that has been laughed at for the last decade, even though the claims to it are negated by every relevant metric about how American Jews are in the United States. Whatever your views on Israel are, make the case. Don't hide behind accusations that people who disagree with you are part of the new anti-Semitism, need to be silenced, need to be scorned. There are a million reasons to oppose what Israel is doing in Gaza, and 10 million reasons to oppose the idea that it's the United States and the American citizen that needs to fund and arm that without being accused of anti-Semitism. And as an American Jew, as somebody who's lived the vast bulk of my life in the United States as an American Jew, the idea that American Jews are this unique, vulnerable victim group is grotesque and manipulative and deeply insulting, and yet is probably the leading instrument that pro-Israel elites in the United States are now weaponizing in order to coerce support for their cause.